How do you get rid of the beetle?
There are millions of them. There's no way to do it. I wish it were, but they're everywhere. Yes?
Last week you talked about those leaf eater
Ants, uh-huh.
And I didn't get a whole lot of information, and then Sunday my daughter told me she has a bunch of them. What did you say you used to get rid of those?
They're hard to get rid of. They are a major problem. If they're eating the leaves on a tree, you can keep them off the tree by wrapping the trunk of the tree with saran wrap or aluminum foil and then putting a 2-inch wide band of something called tanglefoot. Sticky, nasty stuff. Makes axle grease look good. But the ants can't climb over that. If you want to try to get rid of the colony of cut ants, the colony is probably going to be as big as this central area here in this room. And what it is a big underground chamber. The ants don't eat the leaves. They take the leaves down, they put them in this chamber, they eat a fungus that grows on the leaves. The only way that we have found that has any success rate, and even that is not 100%, is to go back to find that mound. It'll be pretty easily identifiable. Usually it's just a bare piece of ground, and you'll see a bunch of different entrances into it. But sprinkle the top of the mound liberally with wettable sulfur. Sulfur, yeah. Sulfur is a natural fungicide. We don't use it in general because it kills too many good fungi. But in this case, you want to really coat the top of the cut ant mound with sulfur. Water it very good so the sulfur gets carried down into the leaf chamber. The sulfur kills the fungus that the ants are eating, and the colony either dies or moves on.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly, yes ma'am.
What's the best way to cut or lower Asian jasmine ground cover? Mine's gotten too high.
Yeah, with Asiatic jasmine, you ought to cut it a little bit every year. Where that doesn't get done, you almost have to just go back, do it in this time of year, and practically mow it off. You'll kill some of it will come back out, but it'll come back out pretty quickly, and it'll take a little while to fill in. It'll look nasty for, 3 or 4 months, but that's just the price for having let it get too big the first time.
Well, I keep telling my yard man to lower it, and he doesn't listen.
Well, I understand.
I can't do it. So.
I'll tell you one thing too. He lives in Mexico. Has been married to a Mexican national for 35 years or so. And Eugenio explained to me something that has helped me so much, and that is the meaning of the word mañana. Everybody thinks you understand what mañana means, right? What do you think mañana means?
Tomorrow.
No. No, Eugenio told me it means not today. So when your yard man tells you he's going to do it mañana, doesn't mean he has any intention of coming back tomorrow and doing it. It simply means I'm not going to do it today. So you stay on your yard man, your husband, your son, whoever your yard man is, and make sure that he gets it cut down every year, or otherwise you'll end up in the position where you are.
Do you use a trimmer or do you use a lawnmower?
If you're doing it every year, you can probably do it with a line trimmer. If you're doing it with a lawnmower, it's going to be a tough job. If it's just really badly overgrown, what you're probably going to have to do is get in there with a pair of these shears and just, not the pruning shears. These are
The lopping kind.
These, are true shears. And that's probably what you're going to have to use to do that.
Do you ever have anyone come in that'll sharpen shears?
That's a good question. There's a fellow named Tom Harris, and if you ever go to any of the garden shows around or any events where the garden volunteers of South Texas are, he sharpens shears, does a very good job of it. He charges $2 donation is what he charges. I think he'll probably be at the Festival of Flowers, and again, go to a meeting of garden volunteers sometime. He sits back in the back of the room and sharpens shears. It can be a little distracting when you're trying to give a talk, as I was doing 2 weeks ago, and you hear the sound of the shears on the stone back there. But it's an art, and not many people do it. He's the only guy I know that I would trust. If you know anyone who sharpens scissors, they'll probably do a pretty good job of sharpening your shears as well. Yes, sir.
Back to the old problem. How do you know if you've got your tree's got oak wilt?
In the case of a red oak, it's going to get a bronzy brown color and die. And that's the indication you've got oak wilt. Dies faster than anything else. In the case of a live oak, the typical symptom, although there are other things that will cause a symptom, is the leaves will fall off green. And when you look at the leaf, You know what chlorosis looks like, where the veins are dark green and the leaf is yellow? It's like reversed chlorosis. The leaf will be dark green, but the veins will be yellow to brown. It's called veinal necrosis. And that is the typical sign of oak wilt. Now, I've seen that same condition caused by a lightning strike that's hit a tree. It's not the only thing that will cause that, but if I see that, I'm very, very suspicious of oak wilt.
It's not that, I'm not familiar with this tree that I'm California. It's a growth. It's like a bally growth with spiny stuff sticking out.
No, that has nothing to do with oak wilt.
What is that? Ball moss?
It's probably, you're looking at a little bromeliad growing up in the trees called ball moss.
That bad?
Depends on who you ask. If you think it's ugly, it's bad. If you don't think it's ugly, I mean, it's been in the tree for 200 years. You know, I always find it funny, these guys that knock on the door and tell people, and they believe them, that if we don't clean your tree out, it's going to die. You know, no. It may get so thick that some of the interior limbs die out, but that's just because it's getting so dense that there's no light getting through. Whether or not it's bad is whether or not you like it. It's not hurting the tree. And don't confuse our oak wilt with sudden oak death that you had in California. Sudden oak death is also a fungus disease, but it attacks the phloem rather than the xylem and is carried in the water rather than by an insect. I'm glad we don't have that stuff here. Yes, ma'am.
Can we talk about young palm trees and pruning them? Because I hear conflicting things like, don't let them die naturally.
Young palm trees, there are two types of palms. One palm forms a single trunk, another palm branches from the base. The two most common palms we have in this area, hardy palms, are going to be a windmill palm, which grows upright. I guess there are also things like Washingtonias and some of the others that I really don't like because they're not as cold hardy. Then there are things like the Mediterranean fan palm, which branches from the base. In every case, the only live part of one trunk on a palm tree, whether it's a single trunk or whether it's a multiple trunk, the only place on that trunk that's alive is right at the top where the fronds are growing. You can't cut a trunk and have it branch out like you could a tree. I mean, if the top of a palm tree, you know, gets knocked off, if it's a windmill palm, it's dead. If it's a Mediterranean palm, or in most cases a pygmy date palm or something, not as cold hardy again, but it'll put out additional trunks from the base. But it's never going to sprout out up and down the trunk. As far as cutting the individual fronds, it's just like cutting the limb on a tree. If you take off too many fronds, you weaken the tree. But if you need to make it a barer trunk, get in and cut the fronds off. You don't have to wait for them to turn brown.
Cut any of the sprouting limbs off, or if you want.
That's up to you. Never rip it off, because that way you're tearing up the tissue up and down the trunk. But if you want to go through and just cut it off, it's not going to hurt a thing. Yes, ma'am.
Is the fronds, is that the bloom or is that the leaf?
That's the leaf. The blooms, you can let them make a bloom spike, you can cut it off, doesn't really make a lot of difference. We'll get to fruit trees in just a minute if anybody's interested. Yes, sir.
Just one thing about the crepe myrtle. You said so much I got lost kind of.
Okay.
I have one that has 5 or 6 2 to 3 inch stumps coming up. And I know what you didn't like. I know you don't like one stump with a whole bunch of things at the top. How would you handle that? Would you just cut the whole big thing off the top?
Oh, no. I would let it grow up and make a tree.
It's huge. It's 15 feet.
Yeah. I would never touch it.
Never touch it.
Unless it's sprouting out at the base. Remember, the majority of pruning, with the exception of fruit trees, pruning is done to please us. It's not done for the health of the plant. Okay. The two cases where we want to be sure that we step in are, number one, if we've got these narrow angles that may break at some point in the future, or if we have a grafted tree. And I don't really know we have time to get into that, but if we have something sprouting off the rootstock. A grafted tree has one plant at the roots and the other plant is the top. The plant that's the root system is a stronger plant, and it would love to take over and dominate and have the rest of it die out. And if you let it sprout out from down at root level, that's what will happen with a grafted rose or a grafted lemon tree or a grafted peach tree. So anytime you have sprouts coming off the rootstock, you cut those off immediately. But other than that, and in the case of peaches and plums, we may prune for some vigor, but I'll stay around and talk about that in a few minutes if anybody wants to, but maybe we'll do something later on fruit trees. But, you know, what you're doing there is strictly to please you. I would just I would never touch it. Big old crepe myrtles were on the property when we bought it. You know, on up here. I don't think we've ever touched them since about the first 2 or 3 years, and they grow and bloom and look beautiful every year.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Got a couple Monterey oaks.
Uh-huh.
And about this